I'll check the uploaded framework first to ensure I'm following your established system. Breaking news out of Washington, and what just unfolded in the past 48 hours represents one of the most stunning reversals in North American trade relations since NAFTA. President Trump has demanded $580 billion in port access rights from Canada in what White House officials are calling essential national security infrastructure access. We're not talking about tariff negotiations or standard trade adjustments. We're talking about the United States demanding permanent control over Canadian deepwater ports, unrestricted access to the St. Lawrence Seaway, and what amounts to sovereignty over Canada's entire Pacific Coast shipping infrastructure. And Canada's response, announced just this morning by Prime Minister Mark Carney, has completely shattered the assumptions underpinning 75 years of continental trade policy. In the next 18 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how Trump's demand for port access triggered the most sophisticated economic countermove in Canadian history, who's paying the price as American supply chains face immediate disruption, and why trade analysts at the Peterson Institute warn this could permanently end the integrated North American economy as we know it. The question everyone's asking is, how did we go from the world's longest undefended border to Canada, effectively locking out American shipping interests overnight? Let me paint you the picture of what just happened. On February 2nd, 2025, President Trump issued Executive Order 149 demanding what the administration calls reciprocal port access arrangements with Canada. According to documents obtained by Bloomberg, the demand specifically requires Canada to grant the United States permanent operating rights to 12 major Canadian ports, including Vancouver, Prince Rupert, Montreal, and Halifax, plus unrestricted American naval and commercial access to the entire St. Lawrence Seaway system. The stated value of these access rights, according to Trump's team, is $580 billion based on projected shipping volumes through 2045. But this didn't happen in a vacuum. This is the latest escalation in a trade confrontation that's been building since Trump took office on January 20th, 2025. To understand how we got here, you need to know that Canada and the United States operate the most integrated cross-border shipping network on Earth. We're talking about $963 billion in annual bilateral trade, with 78% of Canadian exports destined for American markets. 400,000 trucks cross the border every single day. The Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway system alone supports $161 billion in economic activity annually, supporting over 250,000 jobs on both sides of the border. This isn't just trade. This is the circulatory system of the North American economy. By January 28, 2025, Trump had already imposed what he called strategic tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber, triggering immediate retaliation from Ottawa. Federal Reserve economists confirmed that cross-border shipping costs had increased by 17.3% in the first 2 weeks of the new administration alone. Then came the trigger event. On January 30th, Trump held a rally in Detroit, where he declared that Canada has been using its geographic advantage to extract unfair profits from American shipping companies, claiming that Canadian ports charge American vessels 30% more than Canadian-flagged ships for the exact same services. He demanded immediate access, or what he called appropriate compensation. The market reaction was immediate. Canadian dollar fell 4.2% in a single trading session. Shipping futures for Great Lakes routes spiked 23%. Major American retailers, including Walmart and Target, issued urgent warnings about potential supply disruptions affecting stores across the Midwest and Northeast. On February 2nd, the formal demand arrived via diplomatic channels. The terms were stark. Grant permanent American operating control over key Canadian ports, or face what the White House called necessary economic consequences. Trump gave Canada 72 hours to respond, and it gets worse. The demand wasn't just about port access. Buried in the executive order was language requiring Canada to prioritize American shipping over Canadian domestic needs during any supply chain crisis, essentially giving Washington veto power over Canadian trade policy. Trade analysts at Yale's Budget Lab immediately warned this represented an unprecedented demand for economic sovereignty from an allied nation. Canada's response, delivered this morning by Prime Minister Carney, has left Washington scrambling. Instead of negotiating, instead of filing complaints with international trade bodies, Canada announced an immediate restructuring of its entire port management system that effectively walls off American access while remaining technically compliant with existing trade agreements. So how exactly does Canada's response work, and why is it devastating American shipping interests so spectacularly? Let me break this down in simple terms. Think of it like this. Imagine you own an apartment building and your neighbor has been using your parking garage for years under a handshake agreement. Now that neighbor demands you sign over permanent rights to half your parking spaces, threatening to block your driveway if you refuse. Instead of arguing, you restructure your parking garage into a private co-op where only members can park, and membership requires meeting criteria your neighbor cannot possibly meet. That's essentially what Canada just did with its port infrastructure. Here's the mechanism. At 6 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, the Canadian government announced the creation of what they're calling the Canadian Strategic Ports Authority, a crown corporation that immediately assumes control of every major port facility previously operated under public-private partnerships. Under the new structure, port access is now governed by something called Mutual Benefit Certification. To qualify for this certification, a country must meet three requirements. First, they must maintain tariff parity, meaning they cannot charge Canadian goods higher rates than domestic products. Second, they must guarantee reciprocal infrastructure access, meaning Canadian ships get identical treatment in foreign ports. Third, they must maintain what Canada defines as collaborative trade posture, which specifically excludes any nation that has threatened economic coercion against Canada within the previous 12 months. Let me be crystal clear about what this means. The United States, having just demanded $580 billion in port concessions under threat of economic consequences, automatically fails all three criteria. American shipping companies, as of this morning, no longer have guaranteed access to Vancouver, Prince Rupert, Montreal, Halifax, or any of the 12 ports Trump demanded control over. But here's the kicker. Canada didn't stop with ports. The new authority also governs access to the St. Lawrence Seaway, the critical waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. 38% of grain shipped from American Midwest farms to international markets travels through the Seaway. According to the American Farm Bureau Federation, we're talking about 42 million metric tons of agricultural exports annually, worth approximately $18 billion. As of this morning, American vessels using the Seaway must now apply for temporary access permits, subject to approval based on those same mutual benefit criteria. Processing time for these permits is listed as 60 to 90 days. The Seaway operates from late March through December. We're 2 months from opening, and American shipping companies have no idea if they'll have access. And it gets worse. The restructuring includes what Canada calls infrastructure protection fees. Any vessel from a non-certified country using Canadian ports or waterways during the permit application process faces a surcharge of 12% of cargo value. For context, that's approximately triple the standard port fees. A container ship carrying $50 million in goods now pays $6 million in fees for a single transit. Goldman Sachs analysts ran the numbers this morning. If American companies cannot secure certified status, which seems mathematically impossible under current conditions, the cost of shipping through Canadian infrastructure would increase by an average of 41%. For industries dependent on Great Lakes shipping routes, we're talking about an effective shutdown of their most cost-efficient supply chains. Let me introduce you to the people who are already paying the price for this confrontation. Michael Patterson is a grain elevator operator in Duluth, Minnesota. His facility stores and ships wheat, soybeans, and corn from farms across Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. 73% of the grain Michael handles goes to international buyers, and 86% of that export volume travels through the St. Lawrence Seaway because it's the most economical route to reach European and Middle Eastern markets. Michael's operation employs 62 people directly and supports another 140 jobs in trucking, rail transport, and agricultural services across the region. On February 3rd, the day after Canada's announcement, Michael received cancellation notices from 4 major European grain buyers representing $38 million in contracts. The buyers cited uncertainty about shipping access and timeline guarantees. Without the seaway route, Michael would have to ship grain by rail to East Coast ports, increasing his shipping costs by 54%. At those margins, he cannot compete with Canadian, Australian, or Argentine grain suppliers. Michael told me this morning that he faces an impossible choice. He can gamble that the permit system will grant access before the seaway opens in late March, continuing to accept grain from farmers and hoping he can fulfill his remaining contracts. Or he can immediately cancel purchases from the 218 farmers who depend on his facility, protecting himself from potential breach of contract lawsuits, but devastating farm incomes across 3 states. Michael has been in this business for 28 years. He's weathered droughts, price collapses, and trade disputes, but he's never faced a situation where he literally cannot guarantee he'll be able to ship the products farmers are growing right now. His facility moves approximately 420,000 metric tons of grain annually. If he shuts down operations even temporarily, the economic impact cascades through his entire rural community. Equipment dealers lose sales. Banks face loan defaults. Small towns that depend on agricultural processing jobs watch their economic foundation crumble. Multiply Michael Patterson's story by thousands of similar operators across the Great Lakes region, and you start to understand the scale of what's unfolding. Then there's Jennifer Kowalski, who manages supply chain logistics for a manufacturing company in Cleveland, Ohio, that produces automotive components. Her company sources raw aluminum from Canadian smelters in Quebec, ships it to Cleveland via the seaway, processes it into engine parts, then exports finished components to assembly plants in Mexico and the southern United States. This triangular supply chain employs 340 people in Cleveland and represents $160 million in annual production. The Canadian port restructuring hits Jennifer's operation from both sides. Her incoming raw materials face the new permit requirements and infrastructure fees. Her outbound finished goods, which previously shipped through Montreal to reach southern markets, now face the same barriers. Jennifer ran the numbers yesterday. Even if she obtains permits, the 12% infrastructure fee would increase her shipping costs by approximately $19 million annually. Her company operates on margins of 8.4%. A cost increase of that magnitude would make her entire operation unprofitable within 6 months. Jennifer's trying to find alternatives. She could source aluminum domestically, but American production capacity cannot meet her volume requirements, and domestic prices run 23% higher than Canadian material. She could ship via truck to southern ports, but that would add 11 days to her delivery timeline and increase costs by 32%. She could relocate her entire operation to Mexico, closer to her end customers, but that means abandoning 340 jobs in Cleveland and walking away from $38 million in facility investments. None of these options are viable. Jennifer is 47 years old. She's worked in manufacturing logistics her entire career. She's navigating the choice between financial ruin and laying off people she's worked alongside for 2 decades. The devastating outcome is that regardless of which choice she makes, the integrated supply chain that made her business model possible no longer exists. According to experts at the Brookings Institution, we're looking at immediate disruption across 5 critical sectors. Agriculture faces the most urgent timeline. Spring planting decisions are happening right now. Farmers need to know if their grain elevator operators can guarantee export access before they commit to crop selections and input purchases. The uncertainty window is approximately 45 days. Manufacturing supply chains, particularly automotive and machinery sectors dependent on Great Lakes shipping, face contract renegotiations within the next 60 to 90 days. If companies cannot guarantee delivery timelines, they lose contracts to competitors with more stable logistics networks. The Congressional Budget Office released preliminary analysis this morning estimating that if current conditions persist, Great Lakes region GDP could contract by 2.7% in the second quarter of 2025 alone. We're talking about approximately $63 billion in lost economic output. Trade lawyers at Georgetown University warn the legal implications extend far beyond immediate shipping disruptions. Canada structured its response specifically to remain compliant with USMCA provisions. The Mutual Benefit Certification System doesn't discriminate against American companies explicitly. It establishes neutral criteria that any country could theoretically meet. The fact that the United States cannot meet those criteria because of its own policy actions means Canada has created what trade experts call a consequence mirror. American demands for port access triggered restrictions on American port access, but through mechanisms that international trade courts will likely find perfectly legal. This is the genius of Canada's approach. They didn't retaliate, they restructured. And the restructuring automatically punishes exactly the behavior Trump demanded. But here's what really concerns analysts at the Wilson Center. The timeline of consequences extends far beyond quarterly shipping disruptions. In the next 30 to 90 days, we'll see the immediate impacts: contract cancellations, facility closures, layoffs in port-dependent industries, grain that cannot reach international markets, manufacturing components that miss delivery windows, supply chain managers scrambling to find alternative routes that cost more and take longer. That's the visible crisis. But in 6 to 12 months, we'll start seeing the structural damage. Companies that depend on Great Lakes shipping will relocate operations or switch to suppliers with more reliable logistics. International buyers will establish long-term contracts with Canadian, Australian, and South American suppliers, locking American agricultural producers out of markets we've dominated for decades. Manufacturing capacity will shift south to Mexico or overseas to Asia, following the path of least logistical resistance. And it gets worse. What really keeps trade economists awake is the permanent realignment. Canada has just demonstrated that a middle power can use geographic advantages and legal sophistication to completely neutralize economic coercion from a much larger neighbor. According to research from the Carnegie Endowment, Canada's move will become the template for other American allies facing similar pressure. Japan, South Korea, European Union members, they're all watching this closely. If Canada can successfully resist American demands by restructuring rather than retaliating, others will follow that playbook. We're not just losing access to Canadian ports. We're potentially losing the economic leverage that has underpinned American foreign policy since the Second World War. The data from the International Monetary Fund shows that 63% of global trade moves through choke points controlled by American allies. If those allies adopt Canada's approach, restructuring access requirements to automatically exclude coercive partners, America's ability to project economic power collapses. The Council on Foreign Relations published emergency analysis this afternoon outlining 3 possible paths forward. Path 1 is that Trump backs down, withdraws the port access demand, and negotiates removal of the tariffs that triggered this crisis. That would potentially allow the United States to meet Canada's mutual benefit criteria within months. But backing down means admitting the strategy failed, something this administration has shown zero willingness to do. Path 2 is escalation. The United States could impose broader tariffs, restrict Canadian access to American markets, or take other punitive measures. But Canada has already demonstrated they'll respond with legal sophistication rather than direct retaliation. Every American escalation gives Canada justification for further restructuring that harms American interests while remaining technically compliant with trade law. Path 3 is the slow-motion decoupling. Neither side backs down. American companies slowly shift away from Canada-dependent supply chains. Trade volumes decrease. The integrated North American economy that took 75 years to build fractures into separate, less efficient national systems. This path leads to higher costs, lower productivity, and reduced competitiveness for both countries. But Canada's smaller economy means they feel the pain less acutely in absolute terms. Let me be crystal clear about what's at stake here. The Great Lakes Seaway System isn't just a shipping route, it's the logistical foundation for the entire American Midwest economy. 17.4 million people live in the 8 Great Lakes states. The region produces 22% of American GDP. Manufacturing in this corridor depends on the cost advantage of water transport. Grain exports from the heartland depend on efficient access to international markets. When Trump demanded access to Canadian ports, he was operating from the assumption that Canada needs American markets more than America needs Canadian infrastructure. Canada's response reveals that assumption was catastrophically wrong. We need their ports and waterways as much as or more than they need our consumers. Let's recap the 3 critical points you need to understand about this crisis. First, who's really paying the price? It's not politicians in Washington or Ottawa making these decisions. It's Michael Patterson in Duluth watching his grain elevator business collapse because he cannot guarantee shipping access. It's Jennifer Kowalski in Cleveland choosing between financial ruin and destroying 340 jobs. It's the 218 farmers who depend on Michael's facility, the equipment dealers and bank managers in rural communities, the manufacturing workers whose supply chains just evaporated. These are the people bearing the cost of a trade confrontation they didn't choose and cannot control. Second, understand the scale and timeline. We're not talking about temporary disruptions that resolve in a few weeks. $63 billion in lost economic output in one quarter. Contract cancellations happening right now that shift supply chains permanently. International buyers establishing long-term relationships with competitors, locking American producers out of markets we've dominated for generations. The immediate crisis is bad. The 6 to 12-month structural damage is worse. The permanent realignment of trade relationships is what should terrify anyone who understands how global commerce actually works. Third, recognize the permanent consequence nobody's discussing. Canada has just shown the world that a sophisticated legal response can neutralize American economic coercion completely. They didn't break any trade agreements. They didn't impose retaliatory tariffs. They simply restructured their own systems in ways that automatically exclude countries engaging in exactly the behavior Trump demanded. Every other American ally is watching this playbook and realizing they can do the same thing. When economic leverage becomes ineffective because targets simply restructure around American demands, we don't just lose influence in specific negotiations. We lose the strategic tool that has projected American power globally for 80 years. And once that reputation for effective economic coercion is gone, no amount of tariffs or threats brings it back. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to this channel. We're going to continue tracking this story as it develops, and as the consequences ripple through the American economy in coming weeks, you'll want to stay informed about what's really happening behind the headlines. Here's what keeps me up at night. We're not just losing access to Canadian ports or disrupting supply chains, we're losing something far more fundamental. We're losing the trust and goodwill that made the integrated North American economy possible. For 75 years, the United States and Canada built trade relationships on the assumption that economic integration served mutual interests, that cooperation generated more wealth than confrontation, that geographic neighbors with shared values could build prosperity together. That assumption is dying in real time. And once that trust is shattered, once Canada and other allies conclude that American demands will always escalate regardless of compliance, no trade agreement will put it back together. We're destroying the very economic partnerships that made American prosperity possible. The ports will still be there. The seaway will still connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, but the willingness to operate those systems as shared continental infrastructure, that's vanishing before our eyes. And nobody seems to be asking whether what we gain from these confrontations is worth what we're losing in the process.